Hello, very beautiful community. Let's quickly analyze Putin speaking in Kazakhstan. A speech in which he made many threats, including some new ones. But actually, to close analysts of the regime, including nuclearly alarmist analysts, it's a speech by a man who is effectively saying, if you read it properly, have no intent whatever of using nuclear weapons in the near term. Let's analyze what Putin said a tiny bit. He started by comparing ATACMS and Storm Shadow missiles with their Russian equivalents and pointing out the superiority of the Russian equivalents. And a kind of glee began to build up in his speech at that point. He talked about the missile options available to him as a menu. He talked about them in gastronomic terms. He said, anybody who orders things of this menu that I have is going to be a satisfied customer. As that glee was building up, it was inevitable that he would arrive at his favorite subject, and that is Oreshnik. He said that the West forced him into the test use of Oreshnik a few days ago, in a way that to a politicized population in Russia, if Russia had a politicized population, would be transparently an example of a kind of cry by a man who constantly keeps getting surrounded, outplayed, betrayed, and can't do anything about it. They're always mean to us, and they're always breaking promises. They're always being unfair to us, and we're surrounded by this ghastly unfairness about which we don't seem to be able to do anything. A politicized reaction to that would be one that says, well, we have a leader who's completely hopeless. But to a depoliticized population, that will not be clear. Now, he threatened to strike Ukraine's capital with a conventional Oreshnik strike. And he said that the use of several Oreshniks would be comparable to a nuclear strike, which is a statement that is sort of false and peculiar, as military experts would say in technical terms, but it's a bit of political technology. In this talk by Putin, direct nuclear threats were more in the distance than they have been recently. Having discussed all of this with the greatest glee, he went on to talk about the morale of Russian soldiers. He said they're there to repel a project to destroy Russia. And that's why they know what they're doing. They know why they're there. And he said, whether our soldiers are Christians or Muslims, whoever they pray to, they know their purpose. On the other hand, he said, Ukrainian soldiers are sent to risk and lose their lives by an illegitimate regime for no purpose in the name of an odious ideology. So, this is a message that's about the futility of the West's support for Ukraine, the futility of the West's further disinhibition of Ukraine's use of Western weapons. It's a message that tries to leverage into the legitimacy, the mild but simmering legitimacy crises all over the West. He understands that that's what's happening when the US citizenry elects an orange wrecking ball instead of a centrist politics in which they've lost trust. But he also ramped up, horrible conventional expression, sorry, he also dramatized and leaned into the question of the legitimacy of the Zelensky regime. He understands that Zelensky's heroic speech is itself becoming less persuasive, less authentic, even to the Ukrainian population. Right? And he wanted to push into that as much as possible, because the aim, as ever, for him is ungovernability in Ukraine. So this is a way of leveraging to his advantage the situation in Ukraine and the situation of the West's support for Ukraine in the Biden to Trump transition period. It's not just so clearly that, it's also so clearly that delivered with a kind of confidence. That's to say, he's a man who thinks he's winning, and he's a man who is calmly confident. And he's also not a man who is worried by Russia's economic crisis in an existential way. It was effective. It's the opposite of the ineffectual drivel he came up with in the Tucker Carlson interview, for instance. It was a speech that was designed to dissuade the West from confidence in Ukraine's purpose, dissuade the West from the pointfulness of backing Ukraine, and appeal to the building impulse in the West that the war has to be brought to a stop. That doesn't mean Putin wants to bring it to a stop. It means that Putin wants the West to want to bring it to a stop. And my analysis as a partial nuclear alarmist is that this is absolutely a man who is not intent on using nuclear weapons in the near term. Now, for algorithmic purposes, it's worth saying that the inner core of our community here and on the main channel are sort of agnostic about the use of nuclear weapons. They see it as something possible. You see it, we see it as something possible, but unlikely. The wider audience here and on the main channel tends to feel that nuclear use by the Kremlin is virtually impossible. That's partly because of the algorithmic incentives where we are. Just like there are algorithmic incentives, even greater ones, to dramatize the imminent risk of World War III all over the internet now. So in our bubble, there is an incentive to minimize to zero the risk of nuclear use by the Russians. But as I say, even as somebody who is a mild nuclear alarmist, my position is that this is a man with no intent of using nuclear weapons in the near term. That's who is speaking before us. Now, as he is on a kind of tour of gleeful gastronomic celebration of Oreshnik, let's quickly say a couple of words about how sane this guy is. And I have two views about this that are important. One is quite banal and the other is more serious. As a lot of war correspondents often say who've worked, interacted with tyrannical regimes, after 10-15 years in office with unchecked, informalized power, you begin to lose your mind a bit. So the first thing I want to say is that Putin has been profoundly psychologically corrupted by such a stay in power as his, and that got dramatized during the early 2020s. That means that there's an unhealthy and disturbing rigidity in his thought, which does make him a more unpredictable and dangerous actor. And then further on top of that, I say that there are some missionary and apocalyptic elements to the psychology you find in the Kremlin. This means that you cannot take Putin as the same kind of nuclearly rational actor as the Soviet leaders. He is more nuclearly dangerous than them. But even allowing for that two-point observation, it's clear that today we're not looking at a man intent on using nuclear weapons in the near term, but quite the opposite. We're looking at a man who is trying to leverage all possible political weakness on the other side, lean into Western disorganization and withdrawal globally, lean into a simmering crisis of legitimacy in Ukraine to his advantage, and do so confidently. That's to say, this is a man who feels that he has the advantage. That's just one of the several reasons why I don't actually think that we are in a nuclearly more dangerous moment than we were a few weeks ago. At least that's a crude psychological sort of placeholder that I recommend. And I say that even as somebody who has made the couple of observations I've just made about the Putin regime. So, not sure if that brought any value enough. I won't give a health update. There's been some change, but I've done a community post on that on the chat channel. I look forward to being connected with you soon. Lots of love.